In 1908, Madge Macy was 18 years old and visiting Chicago for the first time from Iowa. She marveled at the sight of the Marshall Fields Building, the Monadnock Building, a skyscraper for its time, and the Forest Park amusement park. 65 years later in 1973, she reflected on that visit to the park.
This was the first carnival I'd ever seen, with electric lights instead of gasoline torches. There was a deafening noise from the throngs of people, laughing and calling from barkers and shills, from bells and gongs and every conceivable noisemaker. The tantalizing smell of hot buttered popcorn, the peanut shells underfoot, the red and white boxes of Cracker Jack, and the hot dogs drenched in mustard added to the festivity. Madge Macy, Forest Park Review, September 26, 1973.
The Forest Park amusement park was an early blueprint for public entertainment in what would become the century of modernizing society. Safety took a backseat in the minds of park organizers. Rather, it was the big experiment to see what could bring a smile to the growing populace of Chicago and beyond. Following the success of Chicago's White City, there was considerable interest in establishing another Chicagoland park. The Beach Amusement Company was looking to lay the foundation for a site away from Lake Michigan and in the suburbs. The location of the park was scouted at Des Plaines Avenue and West Harrison Street. An opening day was set for May of 1906. However, groups tied to the adjacent property of Concordia and Waldheim cemeteries opposed the idea of a park. The Evangelical Lutheran Ministers' Conference and the Chicago Lutheran Synod adopted resolutions of opposition and protest. This movement stalled the park from opening at its intended 1906 date for 2 years. In the months leading up to the 1908 opening, a local referendum put up a vote whether the park should remain free of alcohol or not. Efforts from the anti-park and pro-cemetery groups proved insufficient, and the park was allowed alcohol. Liquor's role in the park's history may have been the roller coaster car that carried the park's popularity to the top. Since this was decades before the Dwight D. Eisenhower Highway was constructed, the park's entrance was jutted up against the Chicago L station. This was designed to entice passengers coming right off the train to enter its gates. The North Gate and towers became landmarks, eventually the main inspiration for the Historical Society of Forest Park's logo. Popularity and excitement for the park gained momentum, yet the first of many disasters the park would face came 48 hours before opening day. A storm flooded the grounds, and powerful, nearly 70-mile-per-hour winds knocked over a roller coaster structure. Opening day was moved a week later to June 6th. The summer of 1908 started off rocky, but soon the park's rides and fun became staples to many, like Madge Macy.
I will never forget the roller coaster. It stood alone, huge, very high, as tall as a 3-story building it seemed. The curving, dipping course was outlined in electric bulbs. The framework seemed like golden lathes crisscrossed against the sky. It was magic.
During the coaster's descent, Macy said it felt like she was being rushed down to hell. After the ride ended, an exuberant amount of roller coaster goers went to get more tickets, but she and a few others needed help getting out of the car seats after half fainting. 2 roller coasters resided in the park in its debut season: Leap the Dips and the ironically named Giant Safety Coaster. It held the claim of the longest, highest, and steepest coaster in the United States at the time. Whether or not any injuries or deaths actually occurred at the park is challenging to verify, though written testimonies like Macy's set an impression.
My fears are well-founded. People really did fall out of those cars, and eventually, the large number of accidents caused the roller coaster to be condemned and tore down.
The Grand Canyon ride utilized a third-rail method of electricity to jolt riders at high speeds, and was recorded as being a cause of concern. The height of the coaster was eventually lowered because of frequent fatal accidents, as one rider recalled. There was the pneumatic tube, which pulled passenger cars into underground tunnels and shot them back into the sunlight at high speeds. But not all rides were risky endeavors. The shoot-the-chute slide allowed patrons to comfortably land in the lagoon that dominated photography of the park. Right next to the lagoon was a crowd favorite, steeplechase. On this, patrons could ride 3 at a time on one horse car. The half-mile track would have 6 horses and simulated a race. The rider with the fastest horse going over inclines and around curves would win. It became a popular ride for its intimacy and competitive aspect. Chicago historian Neil Gell said it was a sign that the Victorian age was dying and that much faster times lay ahead. The steeplechase was similar to a ride that was built at Coney Island in 1897 by George Tillieu, but the Chicago version was built by the firm founded by Paul Howes. He was a significant figure at the beginning of the park's history and was also behind the giant safety coaster and Grand Canyon ride. Howes also founded the famed White City in Chicago and left the general managing job there to manage Forest Park in 1909. He had foresight that amusement parks would depart from relying on attractions like theater and dancing, which tended to get a high priority billing and promotion. He told the magazine Billboard in 1906,
"Riding devices stand the wear and tear of years, but shows do not. In 10 years, the former have grown steadily in popularity, but shows play out in 1 or 2 seasons. My guess is that in 5 years from today, the summer park will have 80% sensational riding devices and 20% shows, whereas today they have 75% shows and 25% riding devices."
This steadfast philosophy allowed visitors like Madge Macy to leave remembering the exhilarating rides. But just after 1 season as the general manager, he became fed up with the amount of vaudeville theater, bullfights, and Wild West troops the park promoted, and quit. But despite Howe's opinion, the park still flourished with its various shows and games. Among these was the Iron Maze, which was used in an experiment by the psychology department at the University of Pittsburgh. The experiment used to pit students as test subjects. They were blindfolded and asked to successfully cross the maze 3 times. Another game, in what would be controversial in 21st century standards, was called African Dip. The game was a dunk tank. The goal? To sink a black man sitting on the plank. It would be replaced by the Diana game, still a dunk tank, but this time a woman sat on the plank. It was a popular game for those who wanted to see a woman in wet clothes. Though some parts of the carnival are forgettable, other amusements are still standing today. The Grand Carousel was built in 1909 by Paul Howes' company. It moved to Memphis in 1923 and was placed in the Liberty Land amusement park. And in 2005, when that park closed, the carousel was moved to Ohio for restoration. Currently, it is housed at the Children's Museum of Memphis. Because of its popularity and historic value, the carousel was added to the National Register of Historic Places. By the middle of the 1910s, the park had become a seasonal attraction for the community of Forest Park. Each year, a slate of shows, and occasionally new rides, were added. Marketing wanted to make the park the smoothest spot in the suburbs, the best place to go dancing, the place to entertain an entire family, and a gathering spot for fun and contests. At the 1913 prized beef killing contest, live steers were slaughtered by Chicago stockyard butchers, and the meat was served the next day at the free Labor Day barbecue. Times were rolling in Forest Park. In 1915, the park came under the management of Paul Hines. Formerly the park's chief electrician, he worked his way up to superintendent, and after getting the general managing job, he moved his family to live in the front gate towers. Here, 3 more Hines daughters would be born in the next 5 years. But the entrance of Hines also signaled rumblings. In July of 1915, the park hosted a coalition of groups opposed to the rising movement of Prohibition, an event organized by a young Anton Cermak, Chicago's future mayor. 2 years later, before the 1917 season, the Proviso Township held a primary vote for a liquor prohibition. The availability of liquor was vital to the park's success, but the wet vote prevailed, and the park ordered a flurry of new rides. The Hines era was at its pinnacle. Heading into the last months of World War I in 1918, the park contributed to the overseas effort. The U.S. Recruiting Bureau had set up shop near the entrance of the park. A new game was added called Kill the Kaiser, where the objective was to knock off the heads of life-size figures of America's enemies. Among these enemies were reportedly German Emperor Wilhelm, the Sultan of Turkey, and Jack Johnson, the first black world heavyweight boxing champion. In July of 1918, Billboard had released a report headlining, "Business Fine, says Boys at Forest Park." 5 days later, a fire broke out and destroyed 1/5 of the park within hours. It started in the heated swimming pool's boiler room at around 3:30 in the morning. It spread to the power and lighting station, leaving firefighters without water and power. The fire raged until 7 o'clock, when Heinz announced the park would still be open at 1 o'clock, its usual time. An unbelievable decision, which came into fruition. Crowds came through the gate later that day. The fire was out, but the damage was substantial. The swimming pool and the leap the dips were completely destroyed, and so were parts of the giant safety coaster. Heinz encouraged crowds to still visit the park, and on opening day 1919, everything was rebuilt to the public's amazement. Again in September, however, 2 fires with unknown origins were started, one under a roller coaster structure and another in the pool room. Both were put out before any serious damage was done. To conclude the tumultuous season, the park hosted a victory dance to honor the first anniversary of the armistice in November 1919. The dance was said to be the biggest crowd ever in the history of the park's ballroom and grill room. By the end of 1919, the 18th Amendment was drafted, and therefore Prohibition became a part of the United States Constitution. In early 1920, the Volstead Act took effect, and therefore Prohibition became enforced. It was just another blow to the number of misfortunes the park experienced. A few months later, Paul Heinz announced his resignation, taking up a manager's position at a Detroit park. Herbert W. Wright would replace him. The park decided to have a go at the 1920 season, but the absence of alcohol infected a disinterest among parkgoers. Before the 1921 season in March, another fire broke out in the park's Northgate Tower, the former living quarters of Heinz and his family. It lasted an hour and entertained a gathering crowd. Fortunately, the towers were spared. Though it seemed like the park was more of a fire hazard to the town, Forest Park's Mayor Henry Call was more focused on the alleged gambling taking place in the park, and declared he would not grant the operating license for the 1921 season if gambling took place. Through a court action, the park remained open, but one Saturday early in the season, police raided the park. 21 slot machines were confiscated. Call did not want the park to open for the 1922 season, but in a 2-1 vote where Call was the sole nay, the park was granted a license to operate for the season. It opened in May and remained open until August, when the Chicago streetcar strike refused to stop cars at the Forest Park stop. In response, the park closed most of August until the strike was over. In September 1922, the gates to the park closed for the season, though they were never to be opened again. In April 1923, the park's board of directors chose not to open the park. Prohibition had sucked business out, and the departure of Heinz had left an irreplaceable gap in park management. Liquor, which had fueled the park's popularity to the top, was taking it back down, just like a roller coaster. The rides were sold off. The park's land was purchased in 1924, and the North Towers and ballroom were left untouched until they were razed in 1926. Through the Great Depression and World War II, it remained vacant until the construction of the Eisenhower Expressway began. Workers eventually found the old tunnels carved out for the pneumatic tube ride, a reminder that despite any roadblock, that old park would not go silently in the night.